The morning sun rose over Earth like it had done for millions of years, but today felt different somehow. Captain Daeho Kim could sense it as he walked through the gardens of the great orphanage. The air smelled sweet with flowers from a dozen different worlds, and the sound of children laughing filled every corner of the massive complex. The orphanage stretched as far as the eye could see across what people once called Korea, but now it was just home to thousands of young beings from across the galaxy. The buildings were white and clean with big windows that let in lots of light. Gardens connected every section so children could run and play outside whenever they want. The host stopped to watch a group of small blue creatures from the Centauri system. They were chasing bright yellow butterflies that came from the Vega colonies. The blue children moved fast on their 6 legs while the butterflies danced in the air just out of reach. Both species were laughing in their own ways, making sounds that somehow everyone understood meant happiness. Near the big fountain, a group of human children were building something in the sandbox. They worked alongside small-scaled beings from the desert worlds. The desert children were experts at building with sand, and they showed the humans how to make walls that would not fall down. The human children listened carefully and tried to copy what their friends were doing. Theirs. Hyjin Park walked between the play areas carrying a tiny purple infant in her arms. The baby had multiple eyes that blinked one at a time as it looked around at everything. The little creature had been found floating in space just 3 weeks ago, the only one left alive after space pirates attacked its family ship now. The baby made happy gurgling sounds and reached out with its small tentacles toward the colorful mobile that hung above where it slept. Hyjin smiled and spoke softly to the infant in the universal baby talk that seemed to work with all species. The baby responded by wrapping one tentacle gently around her finger. Linear Orphanage was not just a place where alien children lived. It was proof that different species could live together in peace. Every day brought new challenges. As the staff learned how to care for beings with different needs, some children needed special air to breathe. Others had to hang upside down when they slept. A few could only eat certain types of plants that grew on their home worlds. Dr. Sungmin Lee stood in his office on the top floor of the main building. He could see the entire complex from his big window. Hundreds of children played in areas designed just for them. Flying creatures soared through tall spaces with soft nets to catch them if they got tired. Digging species had deep sand pits where they could burrow and hide. Climbing species had tall jungle gyms that looked like the forests from their home planets. The doctor had run the orphanage for 15 years. He had seen it grow from a small building with 50 human children to this massive place that housed over 10,000 young beings from across the galaxy. Every child had a story of how they came to be here. Some had lost their families in accidents, others had been abandoned on distant planets, a few had been rescued from bad situations. What made the orphanage special was not its size or its technology. It was the way everyone treated each other. Every child was important no matter what they looked like or where they came from. The human staff had learned to speak dozens of languages and understand hundreds of different customs. They knew which children needed darkness to sleep and which ones were afraid of being alone. The daily routine started early with breakfast in the great dining hall. The room was huge with tables and chairs of different sizes to fit every type of body. Children who could not sit in regular chairs had special places designed just for them. The kitchen staff prepared foods that met the needs of every species, from liquid nutrients for energy beings to raw meat for the young predators. After breakfast came learning time, but not the old boring way of sitting in rows and listening to teachers talk. The orphanage had developed new ways of teaching that worked for every type of mind. Visual learners watched Halley displays, while creatures who learned by touch worked with special materials. Some species learned best by moving around, while others needed complete quiet. The afternoon was for playing, and the orphanage had games that beings with tentacles, claws, wings, or regular arms could all enjoy together. Sports were modified so that fast flyers competed fairly against quick runners. Water games included both air breathers and those who lived underwater. Art projects used materials that were safe for species who might accidentally eat them. Captain Daeho had been the head of security for 5 years, but most days his job felt more like being a playground monitor than a soldier. The biggest problems were usually children who did not want to take naps or young beings who got into fights over toys. The orphanage had not had a real security threat in over a decade. The complex had defenses, of course. Energy shields could protect the buildings from space debris or bad weather. Emergency systems could seal different sections if there was a problem. Medical facilities could handle injuries for dozens of different body types, but these systems had been designed for accidents, not for attacks. Earth itself had been peaceful for over 50 years. The great wars that had once torn the planet apart were ancient history. Now humans had learned to solve problems with words instead of weapons. Most people alive had never seen real fighting except in old history recordings. The galaxy around Earth was mostly peaceful too. Different species traded with each other and worked together on big projects like building new star stations or exploring distant systems. There were still some conflicts in faraway places, but nothing that affected the core worlds where most people lived. The hegemony was known to exist, but they kept to themselves in the outer regions. Most beings thought of them as just another group of species who preferred to live alone. They had different ideas about how societies should work, but that was their choice. The galaxy was big enough for everyone to live the way they wanted. Children at the orphanage sometimes asked about their homeworlds and what had happened to their families. The staff always answered honestly but gently. They explained that sometimes bad things happened that no one could prevent, but that did not mean the children were alone. They had a new family now, with thousands of brothers and sisters from across the stars. The medical center was always busy, but with routine care rather than emergencies. Dr. Kim Jae-won ran the facility and had become expert in treating injuries and illnesses. In dozens of species, she had developed new medicines that worked across different biologies and surgical techniques that could save lives, regardless of what type of body the patient had. Education was the heart of what made the orphanage work. Children learned not just facts and skills, but how to understand and respect beings who were different from themselves. They studied the histories of different worlds and learned why diversity made everyone stronger. Human children grew up speaking alien languages as easily as their own. The evening routine was special time when children gathered in small groups with their favorite caregivers. Some species needed bedtime stories, while others required certain sounds or smells to fall asleep peacefully. The staff had learned all these needs and made sure every child felt safe and loved. When darkness came as Captain Daeho finished his morning walk, he felt the same quiet satisfaction he experienced every day. The orphanage was working exactly as it should be. Different species living together in harmony, learning from each other, growing up to become the leaders and citizens who would make the galaxy an even better place. He could not know that far out in space ships were moving toward Earth. Ships filled with beings who saw the orphanage very differently. They did not see it as proof that species could live together in peace. They saw it as proof that humans had become weak and soft. They were coming to teach humanity a lesson they would never forget. The peaceful morning continued with children playing, caregivers tending to their needs, and everyone believing that tomorrow would be just as safe and happy as today. The morning had started like every other day, with children gathering in the great dining hall for breakfast. The smell of different foods filled the air as the kitchen staff served meals designed for dozens of species. Young beings chatted and they played while they ate, creating the happy noise that always made the human caregiver's smile. Hejin was feeding the small purple infant when the first alarm went off. The sound was different from the usual signals for mealtime or nap time. This was the emergency warning that had never been used for anything real before. The baby in her arms sensed something wrong, and its multiple eyes all focused on her face. Captain Daeho was in the security center checking the daily reports when his screens suddenly filled with red warnings. Long-range sensors had detected ships approaching Earth fast. The vessels were moving in perfect formation and their energy signatures showed. They were armed for war. Sung-min was in his office reviewing medical files when his assistant ran in without knocking. Her face was pale and she could barely speak. The words came out in a rush about ships and weapons and something terrible about to happen. The doctor looked out his window at the children playing below and felt ice in his stomach. The attacking ships belonged to the hegemony, a group of species that believed only the strong deserved to survive. They had watched Earth from far away and seen what they thought was weakness: humans caring for alien children instead of building weapons, humans teaching peace instead of conquest, humans showing love instead of fear. The hegemony leaders had planned this attack for months. They wanted to teach humanity a lesson about what they saw as softness. They believed that destroying what humans loved most would break their spirit and show the galaxy that compassion was just another word for weakness. The first energy blast hit the northern section of the orphanage at exactly 9:37 in the morning. The explosion was so bright it could be seen from orbit. The blast vaporized an entire building where over 200 children had been having their morning lessons. The screaming started immediately. More blasts followed, one after another, targeting different parts of the complex. The beautiful gardens where children played were turned into smoking craters. The dormitories where young beings slept safely each night collapsed into piles of burning rubble. The medical center where Dr. Kim Jae-won had saved so many lives was reduced to twisted metallic. Jin found herself trapped under a fallen beam that had crashed down when the ceiling collapsed. Her leg was pinned and bleeding badly. The purple infant she had been holding was gone. Somewhere in the chaos and debris around her, she could hear children crying in dozens of different languages, all of them afraid and calling for help. The emergency systems tried to work as they were designed: underground shelters opened to receive evacuees, force fields activated to protect some areas, automated medical drones launched to search for survivors. But nothing had been built to handle this level of destruction. The attack was too massive, too sudden, too overwhelming. Daeho watched his security screens show the systematic destruction of everything he had sworn to protect. Section after section of the orphanage disappeared in brilliant flashes of light. Children and caregivers who had been laughing just minutes before were now running for their lives or trapped under wreckage. The hegemony weapons were designed to cause maximum damage to the types of materials used in the orphanage construction. The energy beams cut through walls like they were made of paper. The explosive charges were timed to collapse buildings in ways that would trap anyone inside. The attack showed careful planning and complete ruthlessness. Min tried to coordinate rescue efforts from the emergency command center deep underground, but every report brought worse news. The casualty numbers kept rising as rescue teams found more bodies in the rubble. Many of the victims were children whose unique alien biologies made them more vulnerable to the weapons being used. The attack lasted exactly 7 minutes and 33 seconds, but for those on the ground it felt like hours. Wave after wave of energy weapons struck the complex. Each blast was calculated to destroy a specific target: the playground equipment, the learning centers, the dining halls, the sleeping areas. Everything that made the orphanage a home was systematically eliminated. When the bombardment finally stopped, the silence was almost worse than the explosions had been. The only sounds were the crackling of fires, the groaning of damaged structures, and the cries of survivors trapped in the wreckage. Emergency alarms continued to wail, but their warnings came too late. Rescue teams from across Earth began arriving within minutes, but they were not soldiers. They were doctors and firefighters and emergency workers who had trained for accidents and natural disasters. They carried medical supplies and rescue equipment, not weapons. They had never seen destruction like this. The alien children suffered the most during the attack. Their bodies were designed for their home worlds, not for surviving weapons of war. Species that needed special atmospheres found themselves choking in the smoke-filled air. Creatures that had evolved in low gravity were crushed by debris that human children might have survived. Yejin managed to free herself from the fallen beam after an hour of struggling. Her leg was badly injured, but she could move. She began searching through the rubble, looking for the purple infant and any other children who might still be alive. The air was thick with dust and smoke, making it hard to breathe. The rescue efforts revealed the true scope of the tragedy. Over 3,000 children had been killed in the attack. Another 2,000 were injured, many so badly that even the advanced medical technology could not save them. The carefully kept records of each child, their progress and dreams, now served as identification for the recovery teams. Dia Sung-min was pulled from the wreckage of his office after 18 hours of digging. His injuries were severe, but he refused to be taken to a hospital until every child had been found. His assistants had to promise they would continue the search before he would let the medical team treat his wounds. The survivors were evacuated to temporary shelters around the planet, but the damage went far beyond the physical destruction. Children who had known only love and safety now jumped at loud sounds and woke up, screaming from nightmares. The human staff who had devoted their lives to caring for these young beings now struggled with guilt and trauma. News of the attack spread across the galaxy within hours. Quantum communication networks carried the images to every inhabited system. The pictures showed twisted playground equipment, rescue teams carrying small covered forms, and the smoking ruins of what had been a symbol of hope and unity. The galactic community reacted with shock and horror, but their outrage meant nothing to the victims already dead. The hegemony had sent a message, and they believed it had been received. They expected humanity to retreat, to mourn, to rebuild quietly, and to abandon their role as protectors of the innocent. Hegemony leaders felt satisfied with their work. They had calculated that humans faced with such devastating loss would become paralyzed by grief. They had studied human psychology and concluded that a species capable of such love would be equally capable of such despair, but they had made a terrible mistake in their calculations. They had forgotten that the same species that could love alien children as their own had once conquered their entire planet through warfare. They had overlooked that humans had survived ice ages and plagues and nuclear wars. They had failed to understand what happened when you threatened a human family deep in the emergency bunkers. As reports of the casualties continued to come in, something began to change. In the humans who had survived, the grief was there, the pain was overwhelming, but underneath it something else was stirring. Something that had been sleeping for generations was starting to wake up. The hegemony had wanted to teach humanity about weakness. Instead, they were about to learn what humans were truly capable of when everything they loved was taken away from them. The funerals began 3 days after the attack and lasted for a week. Representatives from hundreds of different worlds came to pay their respects to the children who had died. The memorial wall stretched 4 kilometers with the name of every young being who had been killed carved into black stone that gleamed in the sunlight. Mirong Myung Choi stood before the massive crowd that had gathered from across the galaxy. Her voice was calm and steady as she spoke, but everyone listening could hear something dangerous underneath a controlled tone. She did not speak of sadness or loss. She spoke of justice and what it really meant. The transformation of humanity began immediately, but it was unlike anything the galaxy had ever seen before. This was not the wild anger of a species seeking revenge. This was something much more frightening. It was the cold, calculated fury of beings who had decided that such evil would never be allowed to exist. Again, every human colony, every space station, every exploration ship received the same message. Return home immediately or prepare for total war. The response was instant. Humans abandoned mining operations that had taken decades to establish. Scientists left research projects that were on the verge of breakthrough discoveries. Traders sold their cargo at whatever price they could get. Captain Daeho stood in what had once been the main playground of the orphanage, but was now the command center for the largest military mobilization in human history. Engineers worked around the clock to salvage everything they could from the wreckage, not for memory but for evidence. Every piece of debris would be analyzed. Every scrap of metal would tell them something about their enemies. The industrial Capacity that had been used for peaceful purposes for over 50 years was redirected overnight. Factories that had produced educational toys began manufacturing weapons. Shipyards that had built exploration vessels started constructing warships. Medical facilities that had developed treatments for alien diseases now focused on combat medicine and battlefield surgery. Da Sungmin had survived the attack, but his body would never fully recover from his injuries. He refused all offers of medical retirement, and instead became the head of strategic planning. His intimate knowledge of how to protect and care for vulnerable beings translated perfectly into understanding how to eliminate threats against them. The recruitment centers that opened across Earth drew lines of volunteers that stretched beyond the horizon. These were not young people looking for adventure. These were teachers and doctors and engineers who had watched the broadcasts of the attack and decided they would not live in a galaxy where children could be murdered for being different. But the most significant change was in how humanity approached warfare itself. For generations, humans had fought with rules and limitations. They had developed codes of conduct and humanitarian laws. They had tried to minimize civilian casualties and treat prisoners with dignity. All of that disappeared in a single moment of clarity. The species that had once fought with honor now embraced something that terrified their enemies. Total war, not total in the sense of destroying everything, but total in the commitment to victory regardless of cost. The hegemony had shown what they were capable of when they faced no resistance. Now they would learn what humans were capable of when they faced no mercy. Hee-jin had insisted on joining the war effort despite her injuries. She could no longer work directly with children, but she could help ensure that no other caregiver would ever experience what she had lived through. Her knowledge of alien biology gained through years of gentle care now served a different purpose. The first human strike came exactly 1 month after the orphanage attack. A hegemony supply depot in a remote star system simply vanished. The installation had been protected by energy shields that could withstand the output of a small star. It had defensive weapons that could destroy entire fleets. It had early warning systems that could detect approaching ships from light years away. None of it mattered. The human attack was so precise and so overwhelming that the depot was completely destroyed before anyone inside could even send a distress signal. The weapons used in the attack were technologies that should not have existed. The hegemony had been prepared for human retaliation, but not for this level of advancement achieved in just weeks. The speed of human adaptation shocked every species in the galaxy. Civilizations that had spent centuries developing their military technologies watched as humanity leapfrogged their capabilities in mere months. The same innovative thinking that had created universal learning systems for alien children now focused on the puzzle of efficient enemy destruction. Intelligence networks that had been used to locate orphaned children across the galaxy were repurposed to track down hegemony assets. Communication systems that had connected human colonies in peaceful cooperation now coordinated military operations on a scale that dwarfed anything previously seen. Logistics networks that had supplied the orphanage now moved weapons and soldiers with ruthless efficiency. The hegemony leadership had expected humanity to mourn and rebuild and perhaps seek justice through diplomatic channels. Instead, they found themselves facing an enemy that had transformed overnight from peaceful caregivers into something that had no precedent in galactic history. Humanity had declared that their enemies would cease to exist as organized entities. Second attack came a week later. 3 hegemony patrol fleets that had been hunting for human ships were found drifting in space. The crews were alive, but their weapons and engines had been surgically removed with precision that defied explanation. The ships themselves were left intact with a simple message painted on their hulls in the hegemony language: "We are coming." Da Sungmin worked from his wheelchair directing operations that spanned dozens of star systems. His understanding of how to nurture young beings had given him insights into how to protect them through the complete elimination of threats. He planned each attack with the same careful attention he had once given to designing play areas. The psychological impact on the hegemony was immediate and devastating. Their entire civilization was built on the belief that strength was the only virtue that mattered. They believed the weak deserved to be conquered and the strong deserved to rule. Humanity shattered that worldview by proving that compassion and strength were not opposites but partners. The third attack targeted a hegemony training facility where young soldiers learned to use the same weapons that had destroyed the orphanage. The facility was not destroyed. Instead, every weapon was disabled, every computer was wiped, and a holographic message was left playing on repeat, showing images of the dead children and the words, "This is what you did there." Hegemony tried to respond with their own attacks but found their targets had vanished. Human colonies that should have been easy to destroy were simply gone. The populations had been evacuated to hidden locations and the infrastructure had been removed or destroyed by the humans themselves, leaving nothing for the enemy to target. Admiral Myung broadcast another message to the galaxy. This time she stood in the ruins of the orphanage with the memorial wall visible behind her. She spoke directly to the hegemony leadership. Her words were simple and clear: "You murdered children. You targeted those who could not defend themselves. You believed that would make us weak. Instead, you have ensured your own extinction." A war had become something more than a conflict between civilizations. It was a demonstration of what happened when a species that valued life above all else decided that certain forms of life were too dangerous to be allowed to continue. The galaxy watched in fascination and terror as humanity methodically began to erase their enemies from existence. Other species began to reconsider their own positions. Many had remained neutral when the hegemony had attacked other worlds, but the destruction of the orphanage had shown them what neutrality really meant. It meant standing by while innocents died. It meant allowing evil to flourish, because fighting it required sacrifice. The fourth attack was different. Instead of destroying hegemony assets, the humans captured them. An entire battle station with thousands of enemy soldiers was taken intact. The crew found themselves imprisoned, not in cells but in recreation areas designed for children. The psychological message was clear. You attacked those we protected, now you are in their place. As news of each victory spread across human space, something remarkable happened. The same species that had been devoted to peace and nurturing began to remember what they had been before they learned to care for others. They remembered that they had conquered their own planet not through luck but through determination. They remembered that they had reached the stars not because it was easy but because they refused to give up. The hegemony had awakened something in humanity that had been sleeping for generations. They had reminded the galaxy that the species capable of the greatest love was also capable of the most terrible vengeance. The children of Earth would be avenged, and the universe would never forget what happened to those who threatened the innocent. The war that followed was unlike anything the galaxy had ever witnessed before. Humanity fought not with the heat of passion but with the cold precision of beings who had made a calculated decision to remove a threat from existence. Every battle was planned with scientific accuracy, every engagement designed to maximize enemy losses while keeping civilian casualties to zero. The hegemony military doctrine was based on fear and overwhelming force tactics that had worked against species who valued their own survival above everything else. But humanity approached warfare with the same methodical care they had once used to raise alien children. They studied their enemies, learned their weaknesses, and exploited every advantage with surgical precision. Captain Deho now commanded a fleet of vessels that barely resembled the peaceful exploration ships humanity had once built. These were weapons of war designed with a single purpose: to hunt down and destroy hegemony forces wherever they tried to hide. His flagship had been renamed the Orphans Vengeance and carried weapons that could crack moons. Our first major space battle happened when a hegemony battle group tried to attack a human colony. They arrived expecting to find soft targets, civilian settlements that could be easily destroyed for propaganda purposes. Instead, they encountered a trap that had been prepared for months. Using intelligence gathered by former caregivers who knew how to track things across vast distances, colony appeared defenseless. But when the hegemony ships moved in for the attack, weapons platforms emerged from what it seemed like empty space. The platforms had been disguised as asteroids and space debris scattered throughout the system. That lasted exactly 14 minutes, and no enemy vessel survived to report what had happened. The psychological impact on hegemony forces was immediate and devastating. They had built their entire way of life on the belief that might made right, that the strong deserved to rule and the weak deserved to suffer. Humanity destroyed that worldview by showing that compassion and deadly efficiency were not contradictions but complementary forces. Dr. Sung-min had been promoted to Supreme Strategic Coordinator. Despite his physical limitations from his command center, he directed operations spanning dozens of star systems, coordinating attacks that seemed to appear from nowhere and everywhere. Simultaneously, his understanding of how to care for vulnerable beings gave him perfect insight into how to protect them through threat elimination. The hegemony tried to negotiate, offering to pay massive reparations for the attack on the orphanage. They proposed peace treaties and non-pacts and even offered to surrender some of their territory. Humanity's response was delivered by Admiral Mi-young in a broadcast that reached every inhabited world. You do not negotiate with cancer. You remove it completely. The second major engagement came when hegemony forces tried to make a stand around their primary military academy. The facility trained the elite soldiers who carried out attacks like the one on the orphanage. It was protected by the most advanced defenses the hegemony possessed, including weapons that could destroy entire planets. The human attack began with a demonstration that redefined what was possible in space warfare. Instead of trying to break through the defenses, the attacking fleet simply made them irrelevant. The weapons they used operated on principles that seemed to violate the known laws of physics, creating localized disruptions in space-time itself. The Academy defenses that could withstand bombardment from 1,000 ships were bypassed entirely. The human weapons struck directly at the target, ignoring shields and armor as if they did not exist. The facility was not destroyed, but surgically disabled. Every weapon removed, every computer wiped, every record erased. Hai-jin had become a specialist in enemy psychology, using her deep understanding of different species to predict hegemony movements and decision patterns. Her work led to strategies that turned the enemy's own nature against them. Hegemony commanders found themselves fighting not just superior technology but superior intelligence that anticipated their every move. The war became a systematic dismantling of everything the hegemony had built over centuries. Each engagement was planned to achieve maximum strategic impact. While minimizing the resources required, humanity did not waste time or energy on dramatic gestures. They simply identified problems and solved them with terrifying efficiency. The speed of human advance across hegemony space was unprecedented. Systems that had been under enemy control for decades were liberated in days. The methodology was always the same: arrive without warning, eliminate all military resistance, establish secure zones for any civilians, then move on to the next target. Species began joining the war effort, but not as traditional allies. They came as observers trying to understand how humanity had achieved such devastating effectiveness in such a short time. They wanted to learn from the example, but found that what they were witnessing could not be easily copied or replicated. The secret was not in the technology, though human innovations were certainly impressive. The secret was in the fundamental change that had occurred in human thinking. They had stopped trying to minimize conflict and started focusing on ending it permanently. They no longer sought to defeat enemies, but to eliminate the possibility of future threats. The third major battle took place in the hegemony border regions, where their forces had gathered to make a coordinated counterattack. They had assembled the largest fleet in their history, drawing ships and soldiers from across their empire. They planned to strike at human supply lines and force a negotiated peace. The counterattack never reached its targets. Human intelligence had infiltrated hegemony communications so thoroughly that every plan was known before it was implemented. The assembled fleet found itself surrounded by human forces that had been waiting in positions calculated to provide maximum tactical advantage. The battle that followed was less a fight than an execution. The hegemony had brought conventional weapons to face an enemy that had moved beyond conventional thinking. Their energy beams and missile barrages were neutralized by defensive systems that operated outside normal space. Human return fire was precise and final. Dr. Sungmin watched the battle reports with the same calm attention he had once given to monitoring children at play. His strategic planning had accounted for every variable, and the results matched his calculations exactly. The enemy fleet was not defeated, it was erased with mathematical precision that left no room for survival or escape. The fourth engagement targeted hegemony research facilities, where scientists worked to develop new weapons and defensive technologies. The facilities were not destroyed but converted. Human forces took control of the installations and immediately began using hegemony research to improve their own capabilities. The message was clear to anyone watching: humanity was not just winning the war, they were learning from it, becoming stronger with each victory. The same species that had created educational programs for dozens of alien children was now absorbing and improving enemy technology with the same innovative thinking. Yijin led teams that analyzed captured hegemony equipment, looking for weaknesses that could be exploited in future engagements. Her gentle hands that had once fed alien infants now dissected weapon systems with surgical precision, finding flaws that enemy engineers had never suspected existed. The hegemony leadership began to understand that they had made a fundamental miscalculation. They had attacked the orphanage to demonstrate their power and discourage resistance. Instead, they had created an enemy that possessed both the motivation and the capability to erase them from existence entirely. The fifth battle was the largest yet, as hegemony forces made a desperate attempt to break through human lines and strike directly at Earth. They believed that threatening the human homeworld would force negotiations and allow them to escape total destruction. Their fleet was massive and well-equipped. The attack never reached Earth. It was intercepted by human forces in deep space, where the battle raged for 6 hours across multiple star systems. When it ended, the hegemony fleet had been completely destroyed, while human casualties numbered in the dozens. The technological gap had become impossible to bridge. Myung stood once again before the memorial wall, but this time she was not alone. Representatives from dozens of species had come to pay their respects and to witness what justice looked like when applied with absolute determination. The war was nearly over, and everyone knew what the outcome would be. Galaxy had learned that humanity possessed two faces. One was the gentle caregiver who would sacrifice everything to protect the innocent. The other was the implacable destroyer, who would remove any threat to those under their protection. Both faces belonged to the same species, and both were equally real and equally dangerous. The final battle took place in the hegemony home system, where their leadership had gathered every remaining ship, every available soldier, every weapon they possessed for one last desperate stand. They had turned their entire civilization into a military force and fortified their worlds with defenses that should have been impossible to overcome. The siege that the hegemony prepared for lasted exactly 6 hours. Humanity had not come to lay siege to enemy worlds, they had come to end a war that was already decided. The weapons they brought represented the culmination of months of focused innovation driven by the same creative thinking that had once designed games for children with tentacles. Captain Daeho led the final assault, commanding a fleet that moved through hegemony defenses like they were made of paper. The enemy weapons designed to intimidate and destroy were neutralized by technologies that seemed to exist partially outside normal reality. Shields that could stop the energy output of stars were penetrated by forces that bypassed physical barriers entirely. The hegemony had prepared for conventional warfare but faced something that redefined what was possible. Their massive defensive platforms were not destroyed, but simply switched off as human forces demonstrated the ability to take control of enemy systems from impossible distances. The battle was not fought, it was administered. Sungmin coordinated the final operation from his command center, watching as decades of hegemony military development was rendered obsolete in a matter of hours. His planning had accounted for every defensive measure, every possible response, every desperate last-minute tactic the enemy might attempt. The hegemony leadership, faced with the reality of complete defeat, attempted one final act of spite. They tried to detonate their own homeworld, hoping to take the attacking human forces with them and deny their enemies the satisfaction of total victory. The detonation. The sequence was initiated and the countdown began. The explosion never happened. Human protective technologies that had been developed to keep children safe from accidents were scaled up and deployed to contain the planetary destruction. The same force fields that had once prevented young beings from falling now prevented an entire world from being destroyed by its own leader. Shijin had been assigned to the medical teams that would treat hegemony survivors. Her hands that had once gently cared for alien infants now worked to save the lives of beings whose leaders had tried to murder children. The irony was not lost on her, but her compassion remained unchanged. The war crimes trials that followed set new precedents for galactic justice. The hegemony leadership was prosecuted not just for their recent crimes but for centuries of atrocities against innocent populations. Evidence was overwhelming, verdicts were unanimous, and sentences were final. The hegemony as an organized entity ceased to exist, but humanity's victory extended far beyond military conquest. In the aftermath of the war, the galactic community had been fundamentally transformed. Species that had remained neutral, while others suffered, now understood that neutrality in the face of evil was really just cowardice disguised as wisdom. Admiral Miang stood in the rebuilt orphanage, which had been constructed with defensive capabilities that would make future attacks impossible. The new facility could protect itself from planet-killing weapons while still maintaining the open, welcoming atmosphere that made it a home for children from across the galaxy. The memorial wall had been expanded to include not just the names of the children who died in the original attack, but also the names of every being who had suffered under hegemony rule over the centuries. The wall served as both remembrance and warning that some crimes would never be forgotten or forgiven. Dr. Sungmin had returned to his original role as director of the orphanage, but the facility was now part of a larger network of protected worlds where vulnerable beings could live without fear. The same strategic thinking that had planned military operations now coordinated relief efforts. An educational program. Shijin worked with the new generation of orphans, including many children whose parents had died during the war. Some of these were former hegemony citizens whose families had been killed in the fighting. They were not turned away because humanity understood that hatred was not inherited through genetics. The galaxy had learned a fundamental lesson about the true nature of humanity. The species that could love alien children as their own could also wage war with an efficiency that approached the supernatural. The same emotional capacity that created compassion also fueled determination when that compassion was threatened. The former hegemony territories were reorganized under galactic oversight with new governments that prioritized protection of the innocent. Former military installations were converted into schools and hospitals. The weapons that had once threatened civilians were melted down and turned into playground equipment. Representatives from hundreds of species came to visit the new orphanage not just to pay respects but to learn how such a place could be defended. The defensive technologies developed during the war were shared freely with any civilization that promised to use them only for protection. Children who lived at the orphanage now included young beings whose worlds had been liberated during the war. They played the same games and learned the same lessons about cooperation and understanding, but they also learned about the price of freedom and the responsibility that came with strength. Captain Daeho had retired from military service and returned to his original role as head of security for the orphanage. His experience commanding fleets in battle translated perfectly to organizing the complex logistics required to keep thousands of children safe and happy in their daily lives. The most significant change was in how the galaxy viewed conflict itself. The example set by humanity's response to the orphanage attack became a template for how civilized beings should respond to threats against the innocent. Wars of conquest became unthinkable when every species knew what happened to those who targeted civilians. Education programs were established throughout human space, teaching the lessons learned from the war. Young beings of all species learned about the importance of protecting those who could not protect themselves. They studied the history of the hegemony as an example of what happened when strength was used without wisdom. The defensive alliance that formed after the war included every major civilization in the galaxy bound together by the shared understanding that certain lines should never be crossed. The alliance was not held together by treaties or trade agreements, but by the knowledge of what humanity was capable of when those lines were violated. In years after the war ended, a new generation of children played in the rebuilt orphanage. Their laughter echoed through halls designed to withstand any conceivable attack while maintaining the warmth and openness that made the place a true home. The memorial wall reminded everyone of the price of peace. The inscription on the wall had been expanded to include words that summed up the lesson the galaxy had learned: never again, never forgotten, never forgiven. It served as both a promise to the innocent and a warning to anyone who might consider harming them. Humanity had introduced the concept of total response to galactic civilization, showing that some crimes were so terrible they could only be answered with complete and permanent consequences. The universe was a safer place, but everyone understood that safety came with the knowledge of what happened to those who threatened it. The orphanage continued its mission of caring for children from across the stars, but now it also served as a symbol of what could be achieved when love was backed by the absolute determination to protect what mattered most. The galaxy would never again forget that humanity's greatest strength was not their technology or their numbers, but their willingness to sacrifice everything for those they loved. War had ended, but its lessons would be remembered forever. The species that had once been seen as soft caregivers had proven they could be the most dangerous enemies in the galaxy. When their family was threatened, the children of Earth would grow up safe and the universe would be better because of the terrible price their protectors had been willing to pay.